Murdorf in the Mortal Flaw, Book 1, Chapter 26, The Passage of Crossing. The tomb of Murdorf faded in and out with the gleaming rays of the early morning sunrise. Waking early, Windsor, Gamanza, Vandorf, Navi, and Osney sat discussing which route would be the safest and swiftest to Shy Kadesh. Mongard joined them just as the coffee was ready. They noticed his finished piece of art and marveled at the precision. After much amazement at Mongard's talent, the men settled down into more serious discussion. "There is only one way into the city," Windsor said, "and it is walled and heavily fortified. But there are numerous ways up the mountain, and I think we should go through the passage of crossing. I'm sure we're going to be met with some opposition. They will try to prevent us from going to the Immortals." "We could go northeast over the mountain and then travel east," suggested Osney. After pondering the idea, Osney reconsidered. "Then again, that's a lot of extra traveling, and that will only wear us out." Fleece, overhearing the conversation, was tossing his medallion. Entering the discourse, he offered his opinion. "I think we should go through the passage of crossing." Raising one eyebrow at Fleece, Vandorf chided the young man. "You mean your stupid medallion landed on that choice?" Vandorf had no intention of catering to the boy's superstitions. "I think it's a better choice to ride through the passage of crossing," offered Windsor. "Did you know that an earthquake caused that split in the mountain?" Boldar informed, eager to enlighten them. Then he began to tell a legend of the great expanse being caused by the conflict between the immortal king and Darvan, but Windsor cut him short, having heard it all before. Bedrolls were rolled up, and the coffee was gone. It was time to mount up. As Boldar was folding his bedroll, his hat fell off. It was then that Windsor noticed the back of his head. "What happened to the back of your hair?" "That bloody dragon liked to have killed me," Boldar spurted, reaching for his hat. Laughter permeated the campsite. "I can make you some hair out of my mammoth," Sorgar offered, rolling with laughter. "No thanks," Boldar said quickly, laughing at the Viking's peculiar head covering. "Looks like a dog's been bedding there," said Boldar. Although there was a touch of humor that morning, the mood of the day had been set by the prophecy the night before, and each rider harbored deep suspicions. As they galloped past the image of Murdorf, none could resist taking one last glimpse at the haunting face. Silence now defined their ride as mystique that had set in from the prophecy remained in the forefront of their thoughts. Although Mongard's head twitching was subtle, it nevertheless did not go unnoticed. While most wondered about him silently, the Viking made his inquiry to Windsor and Navi, who had no explanation. On the fifth morning, just before dawn, Mongard arose to seek his revenge on Navi. He had spotted some red berries just before they had ascended into the mountains. Pulling them, he stowed them away in his bag. Now he warmed them over a smoldering remains of a fire and pressed them into a paste. He knew just how to get the berries to the color he desired, a bright pink. Next he painted the wood of Navi's bow pink. Then he painted a smiley face on the back of his riding jacket. He made sure that he placed it back where it had been and turned the jacket to where the pinkish face was not be noticed. Finally, he couldn't resist running the remainder of the pink paste through the back of Navi's hair as he slept. When morning dawned, the riders ate and geared up. Whispers had circulated not to say anything to Navi about the pink in his hair, though giggles were hard to control. Navi slung on his jacket without noticing the face, exactly what Mongard had hoped for. But he of course noticed his bow, now painted a flamingo pink. Now he knew why everyone was laughing, or so he thought. "Osney!" Navi yelled, certain that he was the culprit. "Real funny." Bellowing laughter broke out in the camp. Finding the joke to be so brilliant, Osney never denied it. Navi never suspected Mongard. His quiet demeanor kept him from Navi's list of suspects. None of the riders knew who had pulled the prank, but no one coughed up the secret that Navi was wearing a smile on the back of his jacket or his hair was pink. He was now stuck with the girl's bow. He offered to swap with Nadora, but she refused, declaring it was too girlish. That same afternoon, riding north, they traveled through the lowlands, crossed the hill of descent, the first mountain in the range of the Great Divide. Legend has it that this hill is where Darvan landed when King Justice threw him out of the land of Shy Kadesh. That would mean that the immortal king would have thrown him over the entire mountain range, Boldar said. Legends, they grow with time, Windsor reminded them. Another legend says that this is the mountain where Darvan tempted Temshar into taking the cursed sword. The hill of descent climbed high into the sky with spires that reached to the heavens. They say that when the moon is full, the mountain looks like Murdorf's face. The range that this mountain is a part of, the Great Divide, was named for the barrier it created between the lofty mountain and the home of the Immortals in the mortal lands below, explained Boldar. The legends associated with the mountains are as tall and lofty as the mountains themselves. They rode into the chilly mountains. The higher they climbed, the cooler the temperature. Accumulative snow carved a crystal cathedral out of the mountains, showcasing a work of art. Mongard was hardly dressed for the climate change, but he never complained. The riders knew he had to be freezing. After much insisting, Mongard finally accepted a coat from Osney. Why would anyone want to live up here in this cold? Cosney asked. I would rather be mortal and live in nice weather than live in this freezing cold. Windsor overheard him and grinned, but he didn't say a word. They ascended a steep cliff, then began traveling through the Passage of Crossings, a natural passageway between two sheets of solid rocks that protruded out from a mountain monolith. This was the split Boldar had talked so much about. It was rather peculiar, as if the towering mountains had been split in half and separated. The jagged edges looked like they would fit back together perfectly if they were moved. It was a narrow stretch with just enough room for the dragons and mammoths to pass through comfortably. This natural passageway spared them from having to climb over the steep mountains and would have been impossible for the beast of burden to climb. Single file, they hiked between the boulders, trying to ignore both Boldar's running travelogue and Fleece's superstitions. The lad was becoming increasingly excited with the prospect of seeing the land of Shy Kadesh, but Windsor felt a quickening in his spirit that danger was upon them. Suddenly, as they came upon the halfway point of the long and narrow passageway, the rocks began to move, closing in on them from both sides. Windsor stretched out his crooked staff, holding the massive boulders back by his power as the riders heeled their mounts into a run. Navi stretched his own staff towards one boulder, and Windsor turned his on the other. Each held back aside as the others drew their swords and sped swiftly towards the end of the passageway. The winged creatures became a bundle of nerves as they flapped their wings excitably, incapable of getting wind beneath them. Run, shouted Navi. Get out from between the rocks. Standing on one of the boulders appeared a man with long silvery hair and cold eyes. He was a familiar foe to Windsor and long-time puppet of Darvan. With staunch allegiance to Darvan, he had climbed the ranks into the high places of the Dark Kingdom. His powers came within his being as a gift from the dark heart of Darvan, whose influence held sway over him. Although the wizard thought himself to be independently owning his powers, he was subject to Darvan, a veil of manipulation and deceit hiding the truth from the wizardry. Looking down at the riders, he jeered at them. He had them right where he wanted them. Suddenly the rocks began to move, and the passage began to close in on them. Dero, Windsor's tone suggested a bitter and long history. I knew you would eventually crawl out of your hole. Seeking a way out of the death trap, the riders raced to get through the limestone portal. Suddenly, riders of Quadar stepped into view, trapping the riders between the large rocks that continued to inch in on them. Zeppelin, Amace's dragon, grew agitated. Amace tried to calm him. If the dragon breathed fire, it would set the rider in front of him ablaze. Unexpectedly, the force of power resulted in an explosion of a portion of the boulder, sending fragments of rock in all directions. Dero, the false prophet, was thrown from the cliff. The circle of riders astride flying mounts took to the sky. Beyond the mountain ridge emerged a host of black dragons, with Quadarists astride them. The riders charged ahead down the passageway and sprang out from the rubble into the fight. Dervs came running through the forest, excited about war, and black horses bearing riders of Quadar in shrouds of black stormed the mountain, some advancing against the circle of riders, others forming a barrier, preventing them from crossing the mountain. The circle of riders were caught by surprise and put on the defensive. Sword for sword, blow for blow, they were now being tested in strength and skill. There was war in the sky and war on the ground. The enemy had outdone himself, and the circle of riders felt their defeat at hand. Supernatural warfare began as Windsor stretched out his staff, lifting Dero off the ground and pinning him to the rocks. With his back pressed against the boulder, the false prophet fought to lift his wrist. With sheer willpower, he succeeded at pointing his own staff towards Windsor. The energy thrust Windsor into the air and against a mountain. With great force, Windsor hit the rocks. Spotting the predicament Windsor was in, Navi stretched out his staff towards Dero, and the force blew the wizard into the air, sending him into a spiral of rotation. Dero's power was lifted from Windsor, and he began to drop swiftly towards the ground. Losing his grip on his staff, Windsor plummeted towards the ground. Navi, turning his staff towards Windsor, but was suddenly hit with a powerful force, knocking him backwards. Windsor plummeted towards the earth, but suddenly Blaze slept down beneath Windsor, catching him. Pointing his staff towards the ground, the dark wizard murmured 3 words, and the earth opened. A deluge came forth from the ground and swept towards Windsor, its waves rising high above the head. Windsor swept his staff towards the earth, and the earth opened and swallowed the waters. Dero, the dark wizard, stretched his staff towards the sky. The wind began to swirl violently. A dark cloud formed within a funnel. Suddenly, a black beastly creature with broad wings emerged from the retrograde rotation. With his eyes set upon Windsor, it flew swiftly towards him. Its brute arms were stretched out, anxious to take hold of him. Windsor pointed his staff towards the demon and muttered 3 words. The words had no power over the beast. Never slowing down, the strong man flew into Windsor, thrusting him backwards with such great force that Windsor's feet came off the ground. Windsor tumbled across the ground, his body scraping against rock, drawing blood. Flying swiftly towards Windsor, the beast that had emerged from the sky picked Windsor up and threw him against a large tree. Moving towards Windsor, the beast gloated as he anticipated conquest. He stretched out his hand and took hold of the old prophet by the throat and lifted him off the ground. Holding him high above the ground, the beast began to squeeze the life out of him. The dense clouds of the sky began to emerge together, folding and molding into one. Taking the shape of a man's hand, the dark storm cloud reached out the sky and took hold of the beast. Relinquishing his hand from Windsor's neck, the beast fell under the weight of the hand. The thick, cloudy hand picked up the beast and threw him across the mountains, and the darksome atmosphere dissipated into the sky. With rage, Dero looked across the ridge and spotted Navi, who was now on his feet with his staff stretched towards the sky. Navi had destroyed the beast that Dero had formed from the sky, so now Dero aimed to destroy Navi. With his staff stretched towards the mount that Navi stood upon, Dero uttered some strange words. The mount began to tremble beneath Navi's feet. A rising symphonic sound could be heard beneath the mount. Rocks began to quiver, and trees began to shake. The piercing sound felt as though the mountain might swallow them alive. Suddenly, a sea of bat-like creatures burst out of the top of the mount, shattering the large rocky crown of the mount and sending an avalanche of shattering rocks. Although they resembled bats, they were larger and fiercer. A hellish, sulphuric, gassy odor filled the air. Debris from the earth rained down upon Navi. He felt his staff leave his hand as he hit the ground. Then he felt a crushing weight on his left leg. He tried to open his eyes, but there was only a cloud of dust. Trying to take in a deep breath of air, his lungs felt dust and particles of dirt entered his airways. Navi tried not to breathe in defeat, but he felt it crawl into his bones. Inca circled the sky in a large, breathing fire at the dark wizard. Then he flew down, landing beside the debris that had covered Navi. With his nose he nudged the rocks away until his snout touched Navi's hand. A black cloud of evil stormed the circle of riders. As they crossed blades with the Quaedaris, a flying devilish creature swarmed them. The bat-like creatures created a canopy of darkness, lit upon the riders and threw them into confusion. Mongard's hand got cut, and a sword broke through Sagron's chainmail, cutting his side. Nevatian was nearly killed, spared only when Vandorf threw a dagger at a Quaedarist just before his sword connected with Nevatian's backside. Nadora was knocked off of her horse and blanketed by a flying creature. The enemy had launched an attack that was overkill. The swell of death rose upon the circle of riders, and every breath felt like a delay of the inevitable. The bat-like beings flew upon Skeener and Boldar. As the two men fought off the hellish creatures, 5 shrouded Quaedaris surrounded them. Their swords were drawn, anticipating victory. The flying creatures created a frenzy, distracting the two men, making them easy prey. They lit upon them with their talons and their constant motion of their wings, squawking to cause more confusion. Boldar bowed his head, discerning the greater presence of evil beyond the hysteria, gathered his strength and charged forward. The power of his horns and the strength by which he ran frightened the horses. Jittery, the horses spooked, scattering their ranks. 2 Quaedaris fell from their mounts, another dropped his sword. Flying creatures scattered. Skeener raised his voice and advanced, plunging his sword through his shrouded figure. Together, Boldar and Skeener fought side by side, fighting back the forces of darkness that came against them. In the quiver of madness generated on their mount, Quaedaris advanced against the circle of riders. They fought, but defeat seemed inevitable, even to Osni the optimist. As the man wielded his sword, fighting Dervs, Quaedaris, and flying creatures, the sudden and piercing pain signaled that a sword had pierced his side. In that moment, Zorgar fell under the enemy, a drove of Dervs leaving the man bleeding. Mongard failed to outrun the flying bat-like creatures. A sword cut through Sagron's leg. Nimri and Fleece lay bleeding on the battlefield. Vandorf fought, but victory was beyond him. The noise of war and the jeering of Dervs awakened Windsor to consciousness. A coat of dust covered him, and the smell of sulphuric gas alerted Windsor that something had been conjured up from the depths of Quaidar. His ears were ringing, and his head and arm were bleeding. Gathering himself up to his knees, he looked across the mount and saw a cloud of smoke and the skies crawling with black creatures. All hope seemed lost. Quaedaris rode the hill like they owned it. They lined the pathway forward like a strong wall, forbidding advancement. The bat-like creatures circled the heavens above the mount, owning the skies. Dark dragons carrying Quaedaris joined the creatures, claiming the territories of the heavens and the mount below. Encircling a mace, they targeted him. Cosby retreated in fear beneath an overgrown thicket, watching from a safe distance. The shrouded Quaedarist moved towards a mace. Dervs jumped in the trees, anxious to take down the lad. They heckled the mace and encouraged the Quaedarist to end him. With great pride, Dero snickered, liking his authority. He boasted of his power and position, counting his conquest and the reward that would come with it. With knowing eyes, a mace squared his shoulders, demonstrating unprecedented confidence, and he stared them all down. One Quaedaris nudged his horse, and the horse moved forward. Another Quaedaris, then another. The Dervs grew intoxicated with pleasure. A mace cast his eyes towards the tops of the trees where the Dervs had gathered. In an instant their laughter stilled, and their heckling ceased. Dero boasted, and the Quaedaris moved towards the lad. Then an awkward silence fell upon the mount, except for the moans and the cries of the wounded. Arousing herself to consciousness, Nadora looked the battlefield over and perceived that they were defeated. Gathering herself to her knees, Nadora drew her bow and arrow and marked a nearby Derv in the tree. She discerned that she was a bit larger than the rest. concluding that he might be a chief among them. With the spirit of a warrior, she was determined to fight, to conquer, and if she went out, she would go out fighting. Releasing the arrow, it pierced the derv. The awkward silence was broken as the derv fell from its high position in the tree. Now provoked, all eyes turned and fell upon her. A large Quadarus turned his mount around and raced towards her. His horse snorted, and his nostrils flared. He held his sword high above his head. Nadora's eyes fell upon his grisly face, his starkly eyes desolate and unfeeling. The dervs leapt in the trees, cheering the Quadarus to avenge the death of one of their own. Nadora closed her eyes, the pounding of the hoofs now upon her, the silver blade etched into her mind, courage with the marks of a caution in her bosom and a prayer in her heart. Meanwhile, kneeling, Windsor stretched out his right hand, and with a word his staff returned to him. His weak and trembling hand reached up into the heavens, stretching forth his staff. He said not a word, but held the staff upward with his shaky hand. Suddenly an arrow pierced the back of a Quadarus as he swung his blade at Nadora's head. Falling from his mount, the Quadarus tumbled onto Nadora. Stunned and frightened, Nadora screamed. Opening her eyes, she beheld the grim and dark face. Dark blood spilled onto her clothing as she pushed him off her and onto his back. An arrow stood erect from the man's chest. From among the thick of the forest came a woman astride an iridescent stiletto, a bow in her hand and a host of brawny warriors behind her. The woman's golden hair flowed in the wind and her fair skin shimmered with glorious assurance. The Quadarus unleashed a steady stream of arrows against the company of mighty warriors, but with ease they intercepted the arrows, snatching many of them out of the air. Windsor breathed a sigh of relief. Help had come. One by one the warriors of Quadar began to leave. Among the last to leave, Dero pointed his staff at Windsor one last time, the force slinging Windsor into a stealth spin and nearly over the cliff. A golden-haired lady approached, setting her mount on the ground, a unit of warriors following. Wearing evidence of war and the shame of defeat, the circle of riders gathered around the woman one by one, curious about her identity. She looked at Windsor and smiled, her refined facial features imparting an air of strength. Navi responded first. "We are sure glad to see you." Then, with a hint of flirtation, he introduced himself. "I'm Aquila," she answered, eyeballing Windsor, "servant of the immortal king. King Justice sent me to escort you into his kingdom." "Would that be Miss or Mistress Aquila?" Navi continued. "That would be Lady Aquila," said Windsor, correcting Navi. Laughing but offering no further response, she turned her mount around towards the land of Shy Kadesh. "I like your pink bow," she said, snickering. "Thank you, I'll trade you." "No thanks, the color suits you very well," she said. "It's borrowed," Navi lied, not wanting to admit that it was his and not wanting to go into detail about the prank. "I'm sure it is." "Why does everyone have to pick on my hair?" Navi said, thinking that she was talking about the green and purple braids. There was much snickering, but no one was willing to ruin the gag. "A bit late, aren't you?" Vandorf asked, wiping blood from a cut on his arm. "No, I'm right on time," Aquila said. "Thank you, Lady Aquila, for your assistance. We were outnumbered and marked for defeat," said Windsor. "You are welcome," she said. "Some among you are injured," she noted. She approached Sagron, pulling his hand bearing a blood-soaked cloth away from his side. Blood immediately gushed out of the open wound. When Aquila touched the wound, it immediately closed. It didn't even leave a scar. "Amazing! How'd you do that?" Sagron said. She walked among the riders, touching the wounded. Instantly each was healed as wounds grew together, not even leaving a sign of injury. Navi interrupted. "While you're on this healing spree, you think you might make this raw place better? A derv bit me, and all this writing just keeps it raw," Navi explained, offering a wide smile. She touched Navi, and the wound was healed. "You have pretty eyes," Navi said. Aquila laughed and thanked him, but Windsor rolled his eyes. As she looked up at Windsor, their eyes met. They smiled. They sallied forth for the palace. As they rode, Windsor pondered the days when he had been immortal. He secretly longed for the days when he was invincible and had no fear of death. Most of all, Windsor remembered the days of eternal youthfulness, love, and happiness. Unconsciously, he turned the ring on his finger. He almost dreaded going into the land of the Immortals because he knew he would have to leave again. But he was no longer an immortal, and thus would not be allowed to stay permanently. The place reminded him of what he had lost, and he yearned to have it again. He wished for a second chance.